Welcome everybody, this is Pablo Carvajal from IRENA. I'm going to be moderating session 5, Robust and Resilient LTES Development Process. This is a part of the IRENA LTES International Forum on Long-Term Energy Scenarios for the Clean Energy Transition. We have a great area of speakers this afternoon, and the scope of the session is to assess how to implement robust and resilient LTES development process. Now, it is not to be confused to produce robust scenarios, but we're going to be talking a bit more about the process of the scenario itself, that to be robust and resilient. Now, the issue here is that intermittency in the development process of scenarios is a problem for better scenarios and to build capacity. So there are two dimensions that we can assess here in terms of robustness and resilience of the development process of scenarios. First is the process to develop the scenarios itself with institutions. For governments that have centralized planning, that means building scenarios in institutions and having a process that is robust and resilient to other types of changes in government. This facilitates, of course, building of capacity and continuity to expand and build more complex models and not having to start from scratch over and over again in this process. So that's the first dimension regarding robustness and resilient scenarios. A second dimension would be for the session to look into is the data itself and the assumptions and how to ensure the quality and validate the numbers that are being used for the scenarios, that there is a relevant process to update assumptions, update information, have proper documentation for modeling or for scenario building, have consolidated teams that have a trajectory and have traceability of information that is feeding scenario building and scenario exercise. So with that, I want to present our first speaker, which is Pieter Boet. Sorry, Pieter, can you hear us? Okay, so we're having some problems with Pieter. We're going to just jump to our second speaker, which is Alec Waterhouse. Alec is head of the central modeling team in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. Thank you very much, Alec, for joining. Please, you have 10 minutes for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Today, I'm going to be talking about developing models with rigor. And rigor, I'll go into exactly what that means from a British, from a UK government point of view. Pablo, if you might move to the second slide. So today, what I'm going to do is introduce a scenario-based model. You're probably all familiar with carbon calculators. This is the latest version of the Mackay. It's named in honour of Sir David Mackay, our late chief scientific advisor, sadly passed away a year ago. But we're releasing this version of the model very, very soon. In the notes associated with this is the URL of this model. You can actually get to it online. I'll cover that in a little bit of detail. The question that we want to address today is describe the assurance processes for the models that we develop, and this is all based on something called the AQUA book, which stands for Analytical Quality Assurance, the basis of which all of the modelling work that is done in the UK government is actually based on, and I can share with you the processes and practices we use to make sure that our models, that when we develop them, that we're actually confident that they don't, that we've done our best to make sure that they're validated, verified and documented so that others can take them forward. So we'll talk about a bit more about what that means for in-house and outsourced developed models. And Pablo, if you can move on to the next slide, please. So just by way of background, for those of you who don't know, the UK developed the first energy calculator and emissions calculator, and we're delighted to see that many other nations have actually developed those since then. The new version that we are going to be issuing, publishing, all the other things being equal, next month, and you've got the URL for it, is a radical, an updated version. So the this new version extends the models to 2100. It gives you the ability to be able to start and end dates at which technology changes actually happen. And we've updated the underlying science and evidence behind each of the technology levers. And for those of you who don't know, technology levers are the things that you can change to alter the emissions profile of your of the modelling environment, of the area that you're trying to model. And one of the other things is that there used to be sets so that you could only have levers that went from 1, which was basically do nothing or do what you're doing now, right the way through to 4, which was kind of putting the man on the moon kind of level of effort. Now you can have fractional values, so you could have half of the effort to putting on a man on the moon, or quarter of the effort if you think about it like that. And we've done a great deal of work to ensure that the assumptions and data align with both the current science that we've got, that we know about, and some of the more complex models that we use in our organisation. We particularly use something called TIMES, which many of you will be familiar with, which is a whole system model using least cost optimization techniques. But the data and assumptions that are inside this model are entirely congruent with those that we use in our more complex model. The big question is really, and the one that I'm going to address now in the next couple of slides, is, so how do we know that this all works? How do we know that there isn't a massive error stuck in the middle of it? And how do we pass that knowledge of how the models actually work on to people who are going to be using it in the future? Pablo, can I have the next slide, please? So there's a few principles, there are 5 principles I think that are worth sharing. Again, you can find all of this material online. There, if you type in analytical quality assurance in the UK government in gov.uk, you'll get a copy of our Aqua book. But some of the foundation principles are: firstly, you can't mark your own homework. That means that you can't assure your own model. Time and time again, it's proven that people are incapable of seeing mistakes and errors that they've made in their own models, primarily because they've seen too many of them, had seen it too many times themselves. You'll see on the right-hand side of this slide a very small graphic that's trying to say that the amount of assurance, effort and time that you put in depends primarily on 2 dimensions. One is the level of complexity in the model, and the other one is the level of business risk that you bear if the model's wrong. So things that are highly complex and have high business risk, we say that the degree of separation between the people who are actually supplying the assurance and those that are actually developing the models should be quite separate. So for some of our larger models, we have outsourced that assurance process entirely to third-party agencies. The third thing that we'd say is that you need to set up time for reviewing models and assumptions. It's important to actually make sure that the analysis and integrity is maintained over time. So it's a process, not just a one-off. The second thing is that, this is the fourth point, is that if you're setting out assurance processes, it's helpful to actually see the process in action, not just the results. So what are your colleagues actually in order to assure a model? And it's not just sitting here, and it's seeing the process on the way through, I think is really, really helpful. And then finally, alluding to the word that I used in the opening sort of section of this, what we're actually really trying to do is to produce rigorous analysis, and for that we mean that it's repeatable, it's independent, it's grounded in reality, it's objective, we've understood uncertainty, and it addresses the results. The results address the question that we're trying to address. So those are the kind of principles, and you'll find them all explained extensively in the Aqua book. If you, Pablo, if you push down a slide to the next slide. So how do we go about doing it in Bayes? Well, there are basically 5 steps, and again, this is built on the principles in the Aqua book. So firstly, you need to document your model. So all of this is mostly common sense, but it seems to not happen very often unless you mandate it to happen. So having a decent specification, having a scope, having some kind of map that shows you how the model works, having a technical guide, and then having sign off from senior analysts to say that that they're happy that the validation, verification, and documentation is all correct is great. Is really important. The next thing that I want to talk about is structure and clarity. Again, if you look at Berghe's quality assurance processes, you can see an example. Excuse me. Excuse me. You can see an example of how structure and clarity could be set out in an Excel model. The other things that you need to do are to make sure that you validate and verify your model to make sure that the model's doing the right thing and that it's doing it right. And finally, excuse me. Finally, and most importantly, is to make sure that you document the inputs and assumptions that go into your model so that you can share those with colleagues who are either developing different models or want to have access to the assumptions that you're actually using. Now, inside Bayes, we make sure that any models that we use, either we buy, ones that buy or that we develop in-house, have what's known as a logbook. And that's a single location which rates the assurance state of the model on a scale from 0 to 100. It locates documents and provides an audit trail, which I think is really, really important. The important thing for having the audit trail is that if something does go wrong, or even if something does go right, you can backtrack to see where and how it worked. If in the case of our external auditors asking us, so how did you manage to make this mistake? If you haven't got something that documents that said that you actually did your best to avoid making that mistake, then you haven't really got a very good foundation to have a positive conversation with them. Pablo, if you can move to the next slide, please. Right, I think pretty much that was the set of things that I wanted to talk about. Again, when the material is circulated, you'll find references to all of the documents that I've talked about, and you'll be able to find the suite of processes and workbooks that we use to track these things. Just to say that in Bayes, we have an inventory of all the models that we use, and we keep we have a target assurance status for each of those models, and we track that over time outside the organisation as one of our key performance metrics to make sure that all of our models are in a reasonable assurance state and that they're ready to use. And on that note, I'll say thank you very much, Pablo, and I'll stop speaking now.
Thank you very much, Alec, for that nice presentation from the UK's perspective. I rescue the thing Mr. mentioned, the difference between validation and verification, which I found very, very interesting, and also that this idea that the scenario itself is part of the process, is not one of or the end itself of energy planning or the scenario exercise itself. Thank you very much. We'll now, for the sake of time, move to our next speaker. But before, I want to check if Pieter Booth is available now. Maybe he can hear me. Or he can speak. Maybe you can unmute yourself, Pieter. No, seem to still have some issues with Pieter Booth. Well, we're going to continue with our next speaker. It's Remme. He's an analyst at the International Energy Agency. Welcome, Uwe. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. So I would like to talk a bit about some of the aspects that I think are important in the robustness of the scenario development process. And I would, if you move to the next slide, please. Okay. And I would like to start to look at the different steps of the model and scenario development process, because I think they are important for the robustness of the overall scenario process. So if one looks at the model structure and the mathematical description, the scope of the model and the underlying methodology define the question, the type of scenarios that can be addressed by a model. For long-term models, it is, for example, the question whether aspects of their renewables can be adequately represented in the model, in the long-term model, or whether one has to look into other modeling tools, for example, operational dispatch models, so to complement or to use a suite of different modeling tools to address different aspects of a scenario. Clearly, it was also mentioned in Alec's presentation, input data and assumptions are critical for the outcome of the scenarios. Clearly, when talking about the long-term future, there are many uncertainties. For example, economic growth, future performance, or cost of technologies. And there one also has to look into approaches how one can address these uncertainties. On the methodology side, there are, for example, examples to directly incorporate uncertainties in the methodology of the models, so ending up with kind of stochastic approach, stochastic programming to take into account these future uncertainties. Less computationally heavy approaches, and for example, to do sensitivity analysis, to do Monte-Carlo analysis, so to look at different scenarios, cases, to explore the impacts of uncertain assumptions on the scenario outcomes. When looking at the scenario results, so basically the kind of the last box that you see on the slide, the actual numbers of scenarios are of course important, but I would say that it's equally important to develop a better understanding on the interactions and the dependencies within the energy system along the transitions to a clean energy system. There are, for example, interactive tools like the 2050 calculator mentioned also by Alec, can help to explore and understand better the dynamics within the energy system. So what are the trade-offs of certain strategies, and can really help to sharpen and improve or develop the understanding of the stakeholders in different strategies and the outcomes within the scenario. For example, we've used at the IEA also a global version of the 2050 calculator to implement our scenarios in this calculator, and that way gives the opportunity to explore the impact of different strategies on the scenario outcomes. And yeah, moving to the next slide, I just want to highlight that data are, of course, quite important for the scenario development process. So scenario development is not about modeling, but particularly I would say from my experience, often much time has to be spent on the data analysis and research process. And depending on the type of the model, input data can range from a wide different types of input data are required, ranging from, let's say, technology data, statistics, economic data, or economic growth, population, and so on. So the challenge is one really has to develop a kind of network of different experts that one has to approach or that has to engage with to develop or compile these different data. And there, I guess, for a robust scenario development process, it's important that governments support or develop the necessary institutions or infrastructure, for example, statistical offices or research centers that can help to compile or maintain also these data and databases, also to facilitate the exchange between different experts, for example, through research projects or other kind of engagement processes. So that in the end is, I guess, crucial on the data side, also then to ensure transparency on the input assumptions, which I guess are critical for the improvement or understanding of the scenarios, and at the end also the acceptance by the kind of policymakers for using scenarios. Moving to the next slide, please. And yeah, here I just want to reflect a bit on what could be measures for a robust scenario development process. I mean, first point is maybe a bit obvious, but I guess many of those who are involved in scenario and model development process know it's a long-term commitment to develop a model and a scenario, particularly if one talks about capacity building. So there, from the government side, I guess it's important that there is kind of a long-term commitment or support for developing capability for modeling, but also for developing scenarios. So it's really a continuous process. It really needs a kind of long-term vision if one wants to engage in modeling and scenario development. That one really has to ensure that there's long-term institutions and support is in place. Next, please. And facilitating development of networks can, in my view, also help this model and scenario development process along the different steps that I mentioned before, talking about modeling tools or data, but also if one looks at the analysis of the scenario results. For example, on the side of the modeling tools, there are already different networks already existing. For example, the IRENA subcommunity, which is based around the Mercalli Times modeling frameworks, but there are also user groups or networks around other models. For example, the open source Moses model, the LEAP model, or the message model. So, and I guess these kind of user groups of models can help in various forms. For example, helping users to develop their own models, to develop capacity or experience in models. Also, networks can help to share experience across or within the community. They can also join efforts to improve or enhance the modeling frameworks to address new questions that are coming up. And final point also there is that to some extent, these modeling groups or larger user base of these models also is a form of kind of quality assurance for this kind of tool. Different people use it, that they can experience and can also identify potential bugs or hint to improvements into methodology. On the scenario results side, I just want to mention that comparative modeling studies, for example, analyzing the same scenario but with different modeling tools, can help to provide more robust scenario outcomes or draw better conclusions from looking at different models, looking at a very similar or same scenario, by taking into account then different methodologies, which also broadens the kind of scope of question that can be addressed within that scenario. For example, prominent examples here is the model comparison studies of the IPCC, or for example, the Energy Modeling Forum in Stanford. If we could move to the next slide, Pablo, please. And yeah, the last point I want to make is that supporting diversity in model methodologies is important. Of course, I mean, there's a German saying that egg-laying, wool and milk-producing pig doesn't really exist. So not one single model can address all questions within a scenario. And they are developing a toolbox of different models, can broaden the type of questions or aspects that one can explore within a scenario. So, for example, looking at energy systems models, which are typically quite well suited to look at very technical aspects within the energy system. But they often have shortcomings that they actually can address, let's say, the impacts on certain transition strategies on the broader economy. So, for example, they are looking or coupling energy system model with an economic model can kind of broaden the question that can be addressed within that scenario. So they are having the capability to use different models or having different models available, which complement each other, can broaden the type of questions aspects covered by or within a scenario. And with that, I would stop here, and thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Uwe, for that brilliant presentation. I take away these three slides you presented at the end. For robust and resilient scenarios, we need 1, commitment, 2, network of experts, and 3, diverse modeling tools. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to our next presenter, which would be Pieter now, if you can hear us.
I see you.
And we can hear you as well. Excellent.
That's
Pieter.
fine.
Welcome.
Okay.
Yes.
Then I'll start. Thank you for inviting me, and sorry for the connection problems. Let's say the first question you raised was, what is a robust approach and how can modeling help this? I think this needs a clear policy framework that hasn't been discussed today, not that much. But I think the UK, for example, is a good example, let's say, in which such a framework exists. In the Netherlands, we have both a climate law, more or less the same as in the UK, and this climate law asks for an annual progress report based upon a climate and energy outlook, and we as PBL are supposed to draft this outlook, and let's say that makes the work, let's say, continuing, and that's important. And secondly, the actual policy has two building blocks. First, we have a climate agreement towards the year 2030. This has been drafted by many organizations in 5 sectoral tables. And we, let's say, we had to help the process, and we had to assess halfway and at the end whether they were on track. And this was very important because we assessed that especially industry was not on track, and that then this led to additional activities by these partners. So I think this interactive implementation could be a very important aspect of a good interaction of modeling and policy. Next, people need trust. I think trust is very important because when, let's say, there is no trust in the importance of data and modeling, then the whole thing becomes much more difficult. And of course, trust can only be earned by openness, transparency, and let's say that when you make mistakes, you have to tell this. I think this was very much in line with what Alec and Uwe told. Our computation. So this is the next point. Let's say, interestingly, the Netherlands is not that much interested in long-term scenario studies. We have made them, and they are not used. Because policy is looking at the year 2030, and that's for them far enough. So we have to twiggle and wiggle a little bit, let's say, in looking at this 2030, knowing that this is not sufficient for the whole energy transition, but this is what they need. We do this in a lot of detailed models, and you will understand this. And I'll explain 2 difficulties we have, which maybe are different in different countries. The first one is electricity, because we are a small country, very interconnected with neighboring countries. We have a European electricity model, but the Netherlands, in our climate law, is looking at the emissions in our country. And that means that when emissions switch from German electricity towards Dutch one or French one, let's say, this has a great impact on our national emissions. And this is, of course, for an economist, very strange to acknowledge, but for policy, this is very important. And let's say only small changes in the marginal costs of gas and coal lead to big changes in either generation in Germany or in the Netherlands. So that's a great thing for us, a difficult thing for us, and we have to work with many uncertainties in that respect. And the second important and difficult thing is the short term. Let's say the models look at the long term, and they look at equilibrium at long term, demand to supply meet, etc., etc. But now we are living in a short term in which, for example, this coronavirus has a great impact. And then this connection between the short term problems and the long-term equilibrium of the model is something we have a lot of difficulty with how to deal with that. So these are the two problems. Does this lead to better decision making, was what you asked? I think it does. And an example is that when we assessed in this climate agreement that industry was not, wasn't meeting its targets, the government and the partners said, okay, then we need different policy instruments, and we assessed then a CO2 price mechanism, and that was accepted as a further addition to the climate agreement. So I think, when you have this right policy framework, then your impact can be larger. Finally, I think what's very important is, and I think this is the same as what the IEA does, is that you acknowledge that the world around you is changing, and therefore once a year you have an update. So not 5 times a year, that's too often, not once every 4 years, that's not often enough, but we have it once a year. And I think that's a good sequence of having updates. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Pieter Boet, Head of Climate, Air and Energy Department of the Netherlands Environmental Agency, PBL. Thank you, Pieter, for that comment. Very interested to see that you brought the policy framework issue, put that on the table, and it's interesting to know that one way to ensure the continuous process and the robustness of the process of the scenario making activities is to assign the scenario building agency with a specific task that it needs to update constantly. That pushes things forward. I think that's the very thing to rescue, and also the trust that mistakes need to be acknowledged, and documented and corrected, of course. We're moving now to our last speaker, which is Vincent van Steenberghe. He's a climate policy expert in the Federal Public Service of Health, Food Chain Safety and Environment in Belgium. Vincent, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Pablo. Good afternoon, everyone. I will speak very much in line with the 3 other speakers on different aspects. Witness from the Belgian perspective, knowing that, well, Belgium is a federal state where the competences are shared between the federal level and the different regions. And well, in this context, it is, I must say, kind of challenging to have a coherent and an integrated approach in terms of scenarios development. So I'm not saying we've been necessarily completely successful in that respect, but at least I want to highlight our approach at the federal level in such a challenging context. And our approach is very much based on, well, first, stakeholder engagement, certainly. So that idea of a process that Alec was mentioning, transparency in the model used, and coherency in the evaluation tools that are used. And if you can move to the first slide, if you can show the first slide, the next slide, please. Where you see here what Alec just presented, the pathway calculator. We were one of the first to benefit from that development in the UK, following David McKay's great idea. And I think we've been quite very deep into the way we used it in a process. So we built a big, long process. So it was more than 150 people organizing, 30 meetings, workshops in different levels. So really technical workshops, high-level consultation groups, not only to discuss about the scenarios, but also to build the model, to develop the model with them. So choosing the kind of levers, choosing the level of ambition, so the different levers, looking at the data, and that's really spending time with those people that will really help making the policy, building the scenarios, and I will not enter into all the details of that process, but there was a process of more than 1.5 year, almost 2 years long. If we can move to the second slide. Then what you see in the picture is the kind of scenarios we've built with those people, with group of people. And well, that time we were looking at 80 to 95% reduction scenarios. We're now looking at net zero greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2050, whatever. What I wanted to highlight is the fact that when you start building scenarios with those people, you can build really contrasting scenarios, like, well, if you look at these technology scenarios versus the behavioral scenario or lifestyle scenario, if you look at the number of cars you have in those pathways, they're just fundamentally different. You have 2 times more car in the technology scenario than in the behavior scenario. And why do we have that? It's because our stakeholders, some of them do feel better with the technology scenario, others with the behavior scenario. And if you build scenarios with them, then you can have the whole picture in front of you, and then you can have a narrative to them that addresses those concerns. And that was the first observation. A second one is we think that kind of tool is extremely useful to build such scenarios, especially with regards to traditional economic modeling. So I'm an economist, and I believe strongly in the use of economic models, and I know how powerful they are. But also, I want to contrast that approach with respect to traditional economic modeling, where we have certainly some limits in terms of those evaluations of the price elasticities that are based on past observations, where we have no systemic changes, obviously, when non-market impacts are not included, these kind of things. And by having that process with stakeholders with an extremely simple model, then you can build on those narratives. And if you can move to the next slide, and that's where I wanted to come, is that, well, we've been using those kind of participative bottom-up approach to feed in a macroeconomic model that has been traditionally used for policy, economic policy in general in Belgium. So typically from the bottom-up model, we can compute, well, as done in Pathways Calculator, usually the CapEx, so the investments, operation maintenance expenditures, fuel expenditures. And well, it's kind of a tricky thing, but then you can try to move these, feed the model, the macroeconomic model, with those data, and then you can build a macroeconomic story of the same scenario. And so it also joins what Pieter said on the fact that people are looking more short-term, 2030. Of course, when we move to macroeconomic perspectives or socioeconomic impacts, we're more and more looking at the short, midterm horizon. And if you can move to the last slide, please. Then you see the kind of result that we can provide with such macroeconomic perspectives built on participative scenarios. Well, traditional analysis of GDP and added value, for instance, on the economy, but also on jobs creations, for instance. Well, we don't see all the different sectors very clearly, but you see things such as, well, the construction sector here, which is very much influenced by the assumptions that have been made in the main scenario regarding the renovation rate of the houses. You see also the influence, for instance, in terms of transport and communications of the very much limitation on the number of cars that we have in most scenarios. So these are the kind of results that are strongly influenced by the bottom-up approach. And my last slide, if you can move to the last slide. So before, well, thanking you for your attention, just because Alec did not mention also that this idea of the My 2050, those participative tools, just to show these are educative tools that are directly based on those pathways calculator, just to mean that you can build a continuum of those tools, of policy tools. You can give the same story to all stakeholders, and I think that helps to make robust scenarios and participative processes institutionally. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for your presentation. Indeed, I want to just come back. I will launch some questions to all the speakers, but I want to start with Vincent, taking from your presentation. So you mentioned in your presentation many times the stakeholders, the process, participatory. Can you just give us an idea of how often these participatory meetings and how many people join from how many sectors, to put some numbers to the process itself, to build these robust and resilient views for the future?
Well, I think it's not that much a question of the number of people, but it's a question of having the mapping of those actors. And so it means that we have also to be in the policy discussions. We have to be in the right places where the policies are designed, who talks to whom, the link with the political parties. So it's really an institutional feeling that you need to get, and then have some informal discussions with those key actors. And also, I think very important thing is to anticipate the different concerns of the different groups. Well, of course, competitiveness issues from some industrial sectors, environmental NGOs, and then to anticipate those point of views and to try to reflect them in a model. And so, well, it is extremely time consuming. It's a lot of meetings. It doesn't mean so many people, but it is a process that's certainly long lasting, and that needs to be repeated regularly, as has been said earlier.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for that response. Now I'm going to jump back to Alec, and Alec, of course, all presenters somehow have talked about the DEC calculator, which is a world famous model that the UK shared with many people working on scenarios. And I know that BASE, the UK, is now working on a new version of this calculator. And the question would be, how does this new version of the calculator compare to the previous one in enhancing robustness and resilience of the process itself, or be it on the institutional bits or in the data? How does, from that point of view of robustness and resilience, what does this new tool bring to the table after the experience with the previous one?
I think there are a couple of things that are worth saying, but before I do that, I should. I was remiss in saying that we need to extend a great deal of thanks to our colleagues in Belgium. International calculators are truly a international piece of collaboration, and they kindly lent us the use of one of their front ends, and you would have seen the front end on the back of Vincent's last presentation. And if you look at when you look at the latest release of My 2050, the UK version, it will bear a remarkable resemblance to that of the Belgians, because we didn't repeat the exercise of developing our the animations. So we need to say thank you to them for that. In terms of how the scenarios are this time, I think our new version of the calculator is going to be easier to compare and contrast with our implementation of of Times, which we do for the UK, because we've taken particular care to make sure that the assumptions, wherever possible, because they're at different levels of granularity, align. And we've been able to replicate what we can see in Times within the calculator. And again, taking my hat off to our Belgian colleagues, they've done something really, really interesting in that they've started to harvest the pathways that people are producing. We did that with the last calculator, but I think in terms of a participatory process, we will now be able to start to collect those from people who've been good enough and kind enough to spend some time thinking about how they would see the future in terms of decarbonisation. And from that, you can actually start to generate what people who've taken time. Obviously, it's a self-selecting group, but you can actually see what people think about the future and how it should unfold for them. And I think that's going to be really, really interesting. Finally, the last thing that we're using the calculator for is it's a really, really helpful ready reckoner in that oftentimes you don't want to run UK times to do something when you can actually just look at the effects in the calculator without having to turn on a massive calculation engine like UK times. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Sure, Alec. It certainly does. Thank you for that comprehensive answer. I want to now hear from Pieter. You're still on the line, Pieter. Can you hear me? Pieter, are you there? Pieter, maybe you can unmute yourself? Well, we're going to give him some minutes, but then we're going to have a question for Uwe. Uwe, you mentioned about having a diversity of tools, and I think it's valid to make a distinction here between modeling tools and the model generators. So the model itself and the model generator. A model for a system, a model for a country, versus the model generator, which is a tool that is trying to capture the reality on which the model is built. So in those two areas, regarding robust and resilience, how do we go about validating or verifying the model itself for a country and the scenario it produces, and then the model generator and the ability to capture the system itself that it is trying to represent?
Yeah, maybe starting with the last point that you mentioned about how to kind of verify or kind of ensure that one kind of gains trust. What are the kind of outcomes of a scenario? I mean, the one, I guess the challenge that we, with the long-term scenarios, face is that we cannot kind of cross-check with physical experiments what is kind of outcome, what we're kind of modeling compared to reality. Because I mean, 2050 is still 30 years away. So I mean, that's probably the challenge. Generally with long-term scenarios, how we can say whether they're kind of plausible in a way or kind of realistic, so to speak. I guess there, what you mentioned is that one think it's quite useful to kind of engage a broader group of models, which could be, let's say, for one specific, let's say, region, country, could be kind of national kind of modeling exercises, experiments, to kind of gain broader range of outcomes, to also see whether kind of differences from different modeling teams or different modeling tools compared to each other. Is it something based on the methodology? Is it something based on the input data? And that way also increasing understanding, let's say, on the user side of these scenarios, the model outcomes, what's driving these the models and why some model results are different. I mean, that's kind of ideal outcome of this kind of exercise, I would say. And then if one looks at the model generators, I guess, as I mentioned in my presentation briefly, I guess there I see the advantage that they bring together different, let's say, users of the same tool, which can be benefit that one shares the burdens of developing and maintaining these models, also ensuring kind of internal quality control of these tools, and also stimulates, let's say, also improvements, enhancements of these modeling tools within this group. Because often different countries have different needs. Could be some country, let's say, in developing emerging economies, is, let's say, more interested in some economic aspects or in what's the impact on labor, for example, of certain strategies, while some other country has other needs or priorities. In that way, one also ensures that these modeling tools are further developed and, as far as possible, also can cover a broader range of questions to be addressed within the scenarios.
Thank you, Uwe, for that response. And you touched upon the last point that I want to ask to Pieter, which is the developing country aspect. The countries represented in this panel, of course, in the IA have robust and resilient modeling capabilities. So the question for Pieter would be, for a developing country, where to start creating a robust and resilient process, and where to start building capacity to build scenarios and a process that is robust. Should it be within the civil service? Should it be in collaboration with academia, with consultants? what role can each of these play in this process to build robust, resilient scenarios within the government and for the government? Pieter? I thought we had you for a while there.
You can hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, that's fine. Okay,
Excellent.
so this is not an easy question. Let's say we try to do this with our, let's say, global modeling approach, helped by European Commission, let's say, work. And what we do is that we, let's say, have interactive activities looking at the NDCs, so the national approaches, national climate approaches of the different countries. And what they appreciate is, let's say, how their national modeling, as far as it exists, but in countries like Brazil or Indonesia, let's say, they have some approaches in this, and they are very much interested in, let's say, the interactivity with their own models and the global models, and how, let's say, new approaches in the global models can help them. I think this is comparable with what the IEA also is doing, is, let's say, and the institutes in these countries differ from country to country. Let's say in Brazil, it's different from Indonesia or from South Africa. So let's say each has their own approach in that, but you have to look at what the necessity in these countries themselves, what they are, and these people know what they need, and then of course there are also possibilities that interns from these countries go to us and go to other institutes, let's say. So also the human part of the interactivity is important. So there are different approaches, but it starts with what they feel, what they themselves think is important.
Thank you very much, Pieter. Indeed, it is, of course, nationally, and I think that has to start nationally within the country, about the needs of the country and outwards. However, it is very hard to develop and build capacity and a robust process with so much instability and uncertainty in many developing countries. I want to just open the floor for one last comment, very small comment that any of the panelists would like to make. Maybe Uwe, do you have one last comment you would like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I guess it was brought up by Pieter, there's a challenge of linking long-term and short-term decision making. I mean, clearly, often in long-term scenarios, it focuses on the long-term, and like the challenge is how one can translate it into short-term action. And I guess there one always has to be aware of the limitations of models, particularly if we talk about the short-term, because I mean, many aspects that are really influencing the kind of what we see now, for example, these days, are often not reflected in our models. And I guess one also has to kind of see model scenarios or models, let's say, as one part of the decision-making process, but it has to complement it by other, let's say, off-model analysis like roadmaps or other exercises.
Thank you very much. Alec, final comment from your side.
Hold on a second. Yes, I was just very taken with Pieter's comments about where and when to whether it's better to develop in-house or out-house. Firstly, I'd say that it's best to start small. So I think I would, if I was advising a group that was starting from scratch, to start with a calculator rather than starting to try and develop something to do with times. You'll learn a lot. The second thing is that I think institutions such as the civil services of a country, if you don't have the capability, there's a very strong to outsource But I think working in partnership with people where you actually understand what you're actually trying to ask them to do, I find it very difficult to ask people to produce something for me unless I've got at least some idea as to how we might go about doing it in-house if we had the right resources. So, and then finally, I think developing long-term partnerships with academic institutions. We've got a long-term partnership with Imperial College in London and with University College London as well, and a number of other institutions where I've built up a good working relationship. And we actually have secondees in from, we've currently got a secondee in from UCL, and that's really fundamental. That's producing a great deal of knowledge exchange between the academic environment and the policy development environment.
Thank you for that closing comment. Vincent, so we go to you. Some closing statement that you would like to address.
Yes, maybe the word trust was also mentioned. Trust with also openness, transparency, and I think it's really a point that we see for robust institutional scenarios. I mean, it's to be really clear on the expectations for modeling, because we see that in the policy process, people see numbers and they believe that is the reality, that is the way it should be. These numbers directly leads to policy making, and I think we should be clear that these results are for informing decisions, policy decisions, to provide guidance, to provide a narrative, and I think that would really help to have, scenarios that are used, shared by the stakeholders, by the people, and therefore by the politics at the end.
Thank you very much, and we're closing with Pieter. Pieter, some last comments from your side.
Yeah,
on the robust
thank you.
and resilient scenarios. Please.
Thank you, Pablo. Let's say we have to acknowledge the uncertainty in the outcomes. Let's say it's not one figure, but it is a range, and people have to be aware of that. That's one. Secondly, we have to adapt to needs. In our country now, there is a greater need for regional assessments. At the same time, of course, it's for global, but let's say we are moving towards the region because that's where the people live. So that's the adaptation part. And thirdly, what we learned from the Finnish introduction today is that we are energy people, but we don't have to forget the land use part of climate policy. That's also important. So 3 small messages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the presenters of today's session 5 on robust and resilient development process of scenarios. I want to thank the audience as well that has joined us. We will be sending the questions that we couldn't address to the speakers. And our next session will start at 4:20 Central European Time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pablo.
Thank you, Pablo.
Bye.